Your smartphone? Ancient Greeks had a computer. Your local hospital? Stone Age people were doing brain surgery. That pregnancy test from the pharmacy? Egyptians had one 4,000 years ago, and it actually worked. We walk around acting like we invented everything, but honestly, we've spent most of history just rediscovering what our ancestors already figured out and then forgot. Here are 33 things that existed way, way earlier than your brain is ready to accept. 1. Let's start with rap battles. You might think trading insults over a beat is a modern art form, but Vikings and Anglo-Saxons were doing this in the 5th century. They called it flyting, which sounds like a weird bird-watching hobby, but was actually verbal warfare. Two warriors would stand up, often at feasts with an audience, and hurl the most creative, rhythmic insults at each other they could muster. We're talking poetic roasts about your enemy's cowardice, questionable parentage, and general life failures. The goal was to humiliate your opponent so badly that fighting them afterward almost seemed unnecessary. Norse literature is full of these battles. Even gods like Loki got in on the action, once insulting an entire room of deities one by one. So next time someone says rap battles are new, remind them that drunk Vikings were spitting bars over 1,000 years ago. 2. Ancient Egyptian women had a surprisingly scientific way to check if they were pregnant, and it involved peeing on seeds. Specifically, they urinated on wheat and barley. If the seeds sprouted within a few days, congratulations, you're expecting. If the wheat grew faster, it was supposedly a girl. Barley meant a boy. Now, before you laugh this off as ancient nonsense, modern scientists actually tested this method in 1963. The result? It was about 70% accurate at detecting pregnancy. The hormones in a pregnant woman's urine genuinely do promote seed growth. Of course, the gender prediction part was basically a coin flip, but still. 4,000 years ago, Egyptian women had a functional home pregnancy test sitting in their gardens. Meanwhile, we act like the digital stick from the pharmacy is peak human achievement. 3. In the 1st century AD, a Greek inventor named Hero of Alexandria built what was essentially the world's first vending machine. You dropped a coin into a slot, and holy water came out. The coin would land on a small lever, which tilted and opened a valve, releasing a measured amount of sacred liquid. Once the coin slid off, the valve closed. It was installed in Egyptian temples, and the priests probably loved it because it meant fewer awkward conversations with worshippers trying to get free holy water. Hero was basically the ancient world's mad scientist. The man also invented automatic doors, a wind-powered organ, and a steam-powered spinning ball. But sure, his coin-operated holy water dispenser is the one that makes you realize vending machines are not a modern miracle. They're literally ancient Greek technology with better snacks. 4. Sharks are so old that calling them ancient feels like an understatement. They've been swimming around for over 400 million years. To put that in perspective, trees didn't exist until about 350 million years ago. Sharks predate trees. They were hunting in the oceans 50 million years before the first forest even thought about growing. And here's something even wilder. Saturn's rings are relatively young, probably only about 100 to 400 million years old. That means sharks existed before Saturn looked the way it does now. These animals survived 5 mass extinctions, including the one that killed the dinosaurs. They watched continents drift apart. They saw fish crawl onto land and evolve into everything from frogs to you. And they just kept swimming, barely bothering to evolve because, honestly, why fix what already works perfectly? 5. The fax machine feels like a relic of the 1980s, something your parents used at the office before email existed. But the concept was actually patented in 1843 by a Scottish inventor named Alexander Bain. That's 33 years before Alexander Graham Bell made his famous telephone call. Bain's design used synchronized pendulums and electrochemical paper to transmit images over telegraph wires. It was crude, but it worked. By the 1860s, an Italian physicist named Giovanni Caselli had improved it enough to send handwritten messages and even signatures between Paris and Lyon. So while the telephone was still decades away from being practical, people were already sending documents across long distances. The fax machine didn't just come before the internet age. It came before the telephone age. And somehow, it still refuses to die in certain industries. 6. High heels were not invented for runway models or fancy dinners. They were invented for Persian cavalry soldiers in the 10th century. Riding horses while shooting arrows is extremely difficult if your feet keep slipping out of the stirrups. A raised heel locked the foot in place, giving mounted archers better stability and accuracy. When Persian culture made contact with European aristocracy in the 1600s, the heels came with it. European men, especially nobles, immediately adopted them as a symbol of power and military prestige. King Louis XIV of France famously wore red-soled heels to show off his status. Eventually, women began wearing them too, and men gradually abandoned the trend. But for centuries, heels were masculine footwear designed for killing people more efficiently from horseback. Fashion history is weird like that. 7. Brain surgery sounds like the pinnacle of modern medicine, something requiring MRI machines and years of medical school. But humans were drilling holes into skulls over 7,000 years ago, during the Stone Age. The procedure is called trepanation, and archaeologists have found skulls with neat, circular holes all over the world. The wild part? Many of these patients survived. We know this because the bone shows signs of healing, meaning they lived long enough for the skull to start growing back. Why did ancient people do this? Possibly to treat head injuries, relieve pressure, or release evil spirits depending on the culture. The tools were made of sharpened stone, and there was no anesthesia. Yet the survival rate was surprisingly high. Ancient surgeons clearly knew what they were doing, even if we're still not entirely sure why they were doing it. 8. Nintendo, the company that gave us Mario, Zelda, and decades of childhood memories, was founded in 1889. Not 1989, 1889. At that time, the Ottoman Empire still existed. Queen Victoria was on the British throne. The Eiffel Tower had just been completed. And in Kyoto, Japan, a man named Fusajiro Yamauchi started a small company making handmade playing cards called hanafuda. These weren't standard Western cards. They featured flowers, animals, and seasons, and were used for gambling games that the government had tried to ban. Nintendo means something like, "Leave luck to heaven," which is fitting for a card company. For nearly a century, that's all they did. Cards and eventually some toys. Video games didn't enter the picture until the 1970s. So the next time you play a Nintendo game, remember you're playing on a device from a company older than both world wars. 9. Flush toilets feel like a cornerstone of modern civilization, something the Romans might have admired but never achieved. Except the Indus Valley civilization beat everyone to it by thousands of years. Around 2600 BC, cities like Mohenjo-daro in present-day Pakistan had advanced drainage systems, indoor plumbing, and toilets that actually flushed waste into covered drains running beneath the streets. Nearly every house had its own bathroom. The drains were engineered with precise slopes to keep waste moving. Some even had inspection holes for maintenance. This was happening while Stonehenge was still under construction, and the Egyptian pyramids were brand new. Then this civilization mysteriously declined, and humanity basically forgot how to do plumbing properly for the next few thousand years. Medieval Europeans were dumping chamber pots out of windows while the Indus Valley had working sewers 46 centuries earlier. 10. Flamethrowers sound like something invented during World War I, a terrifying modern weapon born from industrial warfare. But the Byzantine Empire was using them in the 7th century, and their version might have been even scarier. They called it Greek fire, a mysterious napalm-like substance that could be projected from bronze tubes mounted on ships. It burned on water. You couldn't extinguish it by dousing it. Enemy sailors would watch in horror as their ships became floating infernos that wouldn't stop burning. The exact recipe was a closely guarded state secret, and it died with the Byzantine Empire. Modern chemists have guessed at ingredients like petroleum, quicklime, and sulfur, but nobody knows for sure. Greek fire helped Constantinople survive multiple sieges for centuries. It was so effective and terrifying that it essentially functioned as the medieval equivalent of a nuclear deterrent, and we still can't replicate it. 11. Oxford University is so old that it predates the Aztec Empire by over 2 centuries. Teaching began at Oxford around 1096, making it one of the oldest universities in the world. The Aztec civilization, famous for its pyramids and powerful empire in central Mexico, didn't get started until around 1325. Let that sink in. Students were attending lectures in England before the Aztecs had even founded their capital city of Tenochtitlan. Oxford also predates the invention of buttons on clothing, the existence of the country of Portugal, and the signing of the Magna Carta. When Oxford was already training scholars, Genghis Khan's great-grandfather hadn't been born yet. It's strange to think of anything in Europe being older than a civilization that feels ancient, but universities were educating people while the Aztec Empire was still centuries away from existing. 12. Plastic surgery seems like a product of modern vanity and advanced medicine, but it was being performed in India around the 6th century BC. A physician named Sushruta, often called the father of surgery, wrote detailed texts describing how to reconstruct noses using skin grafted from the patient's forehead. This technique, now called the Indian method of rhinoplasty, is still used in modified forms today. Why noses specifically? Because cutting off someone's nose was a common punishment in ancient India for crimes or adultery. So there was high demand for reconstructive work. Sushruta's texts describe over 300 surgical procedures, including cataract removal and cesarean sections. He used wine as an anesthetic and ants to hold wounds closed like sutures. While Europeans were still believing in the 4 humors, Indian surgeons were performing complex reconstructive procedures that modern doctors would recognize immediately. 13. We credit Alessandro Volta with inventing the battery in 1800, but there's an object sitting in a museum that suggests someone beat him by about 2,000 years. The Baghdad battery is a clay pot containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, sealed with asphalt. When filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or grape juice, it can generate a small electric current. Archaeologists found several of these near Baghdad in the 1930s, dated to around 200 BC to 200 AD. Nobody knows what they were actually used for. Theories include electroplating jewelry, religious tingles during rituals, or possibly just storing scrolls with the metal parts being coincidental. But experiments have proven they work as batteries. If ancient Mesopotamians figured out electricity 2 millennia early, they apparently never told anyone what they were doing with it. 14. Ice cream in the desert sounds impossible, but ancient Persians figured it out by 400 BC using sheer engineering genius. They built structures called yakhchals, which were essentially ancient refrigerators. These were dome-shaped buildings with thick walls made of a special morit that insulated incredibly well. Ice was harvested from mountains in winter, stored underground, and kept frozen through the brutal summer heat using nothing but clever architecture and nighttime radiation cooling. Persians would mix this ice with saffron, fruits, and rosewater to create a frozen treat called faluda, which is still eaten in Iran today. No electricity, no refrigerants, just physics and patience. While most ancient civilizations were drinking warm water in summer, Persian nobles were enjoying flavored frozen desserts in the middle of the desert. 400 BC. Sometimes you really cannot improve on ancient solutions. 15. Robots feel like a product of the computer age, but ancient engineers were building mechanical automatons thousands of years ago. Around 400 BC, a Greek mathematician named Archytas built a wooden pigeon powered by steam or compressed air that could actually fly. It was essentially the first known self-propelled flying machine. Fast forward to the 12th century, and an Islamic polymath named Al-Jazari was building programmable humanoid robots. His most famous creation was a boat with 4 mechanical musicians that could play different rhythms by changing pegs on a rotating drum, basically the same principle as a music box or player piano. Al-Jazari also invented an automatic hand-washing station with a humanoid servant, programmable fountains, and the crankshaft. Ancient robotics wasn't about artificial intelligence. It was about showing off engineering genius. And these inventors would probably be insulted by how long it took us to catch up. 16. Social media feels like a curse unique to the 21st century, but ancient Rome had its own version. They were called acta diurna, which translates to daily acts, and they were essentially the world's first newspapers. Starting around 59 BC, these were official notices carved onto stone or metal tablets and posted in public places throughout Rome. They included government announcements, court verdicts, military victories, births, deaths, and yes, gossip. Citizens would gather around to read the latest news and discuss it with each other. Important people sometimes had scribes copy the acta and send it to them in the provinces. The content was curated by the state, so it was basically propaganda mixed with TMZ. Romans didn't have comment sections, but they absolutely had public forums where they argued about the news. Humanity has always wanted to know what everyone else is doing, and always had opinions about it. 17. Contact lenses seem like a triumph of modern optical science, but Leonardo da Vinci sketched the basic concept in 1508. He drew a diagram showing how submerging the eye in water could neutralize its refractive power, essentially the principle behind corrective lenses that sit directly on the eye. He wasn't trying to invent contacts specifically. He was just exploring how vision worked. But the idea was there. In 1636, René Descartes proposed a tube filled with liquid placed directly against the cornea. In 1801, Thomas Young built on these ideas by actually placing a lens in contact with his own eye. Practical glass contact lenses didn't appear until the 1880s, and comfortable ones took even longer. But the fundamental insight that you could correct vision by putting something directly on the eyeball came from Da Vinci over 500 years ago. The man really did think of everything. 18. Submarines feel like they belong to the age of steel and diesel, but the first working submarine was built in 1620 by a Dutch inventor named Cornelis Drebbel. He constructed a wooden frame covered in greased leather, designed to be rowed underwater by 12 oarsmen. He demonstrated it on the River Thames for King James I of England, reportedly diving to depths of about 15 feet and traveling several miles. How did the crew breathe? Nobody is entirely sure. Some accounts suggest Drebbel had a chemical substance that released oxygen, which would make him centuries ahead of his time. Others think there were just snorkels. Either way, the king watched from the riverbank as a leather-covered boat disappeared beneath the water and resurfaced downstream. 400 years before nuclear submarines, a Dutch guy built a working submersible for an English king using leather, wood, and oars. 19. Fast food restaurants feel like a modern invention born from American car culture and busy lifestyles. But if you walked through ancient Pompeii before the volcano hit, you'd find fast food joints on almost every corner. They were called thermopolia, and they were counters with large clay pots built into them, keeping food warm and ready to serve. Most Roman apartments didn't have kitchens because open fires in wooden buildings were a terrible idea. So ordinary people ate out constantly. Thermopolia served stews, cooked grains, cheap wine, and various hot dishes to working-class Romans in a hurry. Archaeologists have found over 80 of them in Pompeii alone, complete with menu items painted on walls, and even evidence of what people were eating the day Vesuvius erupted. The Golden Arches came 20 centuries later, but the basic concept of grabbing hot food quickly and cheaply is ancient. 20. Nanotechnology sounds like cutting-edge science, but Roman glassmakers were accidentally using it 1700 years ago. The Lycurgus cup, made around the 4th century AD, contains tiny particles of gold and silver about 50 nanometers in diameter. These nanoparticles cause the glass to change color depending on how light hits it. From the front, the cup looks green. Shine light through it from behind, and it turns a deep red. Roman craftsmen had no idea they were working at the nanoscale. They probably discovered the effect by accident while experimenting with metallic additives. But the result is a piece of technology so advanced that scientists only figured out how it worked in the 1990s using electron microscopes. The cup sits in the British Museum, looking like magic and proving that ancient artisans sometimes achieved things they couldn't possibly have understood. 21. Chewing gum isn't a 19th century American invention. Humans have been chewing various plant-based substances for at least 5,000 years. Archaeologists have found lumps of birch bark pitch in Scandinavia with visible teeth marks, some from children based on the jaw size. This tar-like substance was probably used as a primitive glue, but clearly people were also chewing it, possibly for enjoyment, dental hygiene, or hunger suppression. In 2019, scientists extracted complete human DNA from a 5,000-year-old piece of chewed birch pitch found in Denmark. They determined it came from a woman with dark skin, dark hair, and blue eyes. She had recently eaten duck and hazelnuts. One piece of ancient gum revealed more about its chewer than most modern gum ever will. Stone Age people were walking around chewing tar, and somehow, we still have their teeth marks. 22. Automatic doors seem like a modern convenience, something requiring electricity and motion sensors. But in the 1st century AD, Hero of Alexandria, the same genius who built the vending machine, invented doors that opened by themselves. Here's how it worked. A priest would light a fire on an altar outside the temple. The heat caused air to expand in a hidden chamber beneath the altar, pushing water into a bucket system. The weight of the water pulled ropes that opened the temple doors. When the fire died down, the water drained back and the doors closed. Worshippers would see the priest make an offering, and the temple doors would magically swing open as if the gods approved. It was basically an elaborate special effect designed to impress believers. Ancient priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were theatrical engineers using physics to manufacture religious experiences. 23. Dentistry usually means fixing problems, but the ancient Maya were visiting dentists for purely cosmetic reasons. They drilled small holes into their front teeth and inserted gemstones like jade, turquoise, and obsidian. The precision was remarkable. They used a drill made from a hard stone tube spun with a bow, similar to how you'd start a fire. The adhesive they used was a cement made from plant resins and bone that held up for years without damaging the tooth. Modern dentists have examined Mayan skulls and found that the drilling rarely reached the pulp, the sensitive inner part of the tooth. These weren't desperate attempts by primitive people. This was skilled cosmetic dentistry by professionals who understood tooth anatomy. The Maya were walking around with jewel-encrusted smiles over 1,000 years before anyone in Europe had braces. 24. Text messaging feels inseparable from smartphones, but the basic concept is almost 200 years old. When Samuel Morse demonstrated the electric telegraph in 1837, he essentially invented the Victorian version of texting. Short messages were sent across wires using coded electrical pulses. People developed abbreviations and shorthand to save time and money, just like we do with LOL and BRB today. Telegraph operators became the first people to have long-distance relationships conducted entirely through short written messages. Newspapers used it to spread news almost instantly. Businesses relied on it for urgent communications. By the 1850s, undersea cables connected continents. The telegraph changed commerce, journalism, and warfare just as dramatically as the internet would a century later. When you send a text message today, you're using upgraded technology from 1837, just with better autocorrect and more emojis. 25. Woolly mammoths feel like creatures from the deep past, something that went extinct when humans were still figuring out fire. But a small population survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until about 2000 BC. That's around the same time the Great Pyramid of Giza was being built. Egyptian workers were dragging limestone blocks across the desert, while mammoths were still wandering around on a remote island. The Wrangel Island mammoths were smaller than their mainland ancestors, a common adaptation for isolated island populations. They finally went extinct probably due to inbreeding, limited resources, or possibly human hunters reaching the island. But for thousands of years, mammoths and pharaohs coexisted on the same planet. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the iPhone than to the building of the pyramids, and mammoths lived closer to the pyramids than most people realize. 26. Central heating sounds like a modern luxury, but both the Romans and Koreans figured it out centuries ago using completely different methods. The Roman hypocaust system worked by raising floors on pillars and circulating hot air from a furnace underneath. Wealthy Romans had toasty, warm floors in their villas while peasants froze. The Korean ondol system used a similar principle, channeling hot smoke from a kitchen stove through channels beneath the floor before it exited through a chimney. Ondol kept Korean homes warm for over 2,000 years and is still used in modern forms today. Both civilizations independently discovered that heating the floor was more efficient than heating the air. Medieval Europeans, meanwhile, were huddling around smoky fireplaces and stuffing rags under doors. Two ancient cultures had already invented superior heating technology, and it took us forever to reinvent it. 27. You'd think fire came before the ability to make fire, but lighters were actually invented before matches. In 1823, a German chemist named Johann Wolfgang Dobereiner created a lamp that used a chemical reaction between zinc, sulfuric acid, and platinum to produce a flame. You pressed a lever, hydrogen gas was generated, and it ignited on contact with the platinum catalyst. It was expensive and complicated, but it worked. Friction matches, the kind you strike against a surface, weren't commercially practical until the 1830s. So for about a decade, if you wanted fire on demand, you either used flint and steel like your ancestors, or you bought an elaborate chemical contraption. The simple wooden match came after the lighter. History doesn't always progress in the order that makes intuitive sense, and fire-starting technology is a perfect example. 28. Earthquake detection seems like it requires sophisticated modern technology, but in 132 AD, a Chinese inventor named Zhang Heng built a device that could sense earthquakes hundreds of miles away. It was a bronze vessel shaped like a wine jar, about 6 feet in diameter, with 8 dragon heads around the outside, each holding a bronze ball in its mouth. Below each dragon sat a bronze toad with its mouth open. When an earthquake occurred, a pendulum inside the vessel would swing, triggering a mechanism that made one dragon drop its ball into the toad's mouth below. The direction of the dragon indicated where the earthquake had happened. According to historical records, it once detected an earthquake so far away that nobody in the capital felt it. Days later, a messenger arrived confirming the event. 17 centuries before seismographs, Zhang Heng was detecting earthquakes with dragons and toads. 29. General anesthesia sounds like a miracle of modern medicine, but a Chinese surgeon named Hua Tuo was knocking patients unconscious for surgery around 200 AD. He used a concoction called mafacin, which translates roughly to cannabis boiling powder mixed with wine. Patients would drink it and become insensible to pain, allowing Hua Tuo to perform abdominal surgeries, organ removal, and other procedures that would otherwise be impossible. Unfortunately, the exact formula for mafacin was lost. Hua Tuo was executed by a warlord he had been treating, and according to legend, he burned his medical texts rather than let them fall into the wrong hands. Western medicine didn't develop effective general anesthesia until the 1840s, with ether and chloroform. For over 1,600 years, the ability to perform painless surgery existed, was lost, and had to be completely reinvented. 30. Odometers feel like dashboard technology, something that comes with cars. But the Romans and Greeks had them over 2,000 years ago. The design, attributed to either Vitruvius or possibly Archimedes, was beautifully mechanical. A cartwheel was connected to a series of gears inside a box. Every time the wheel completed a certain number of rotations, exactly 1 Roman mile, a small pebble would drop from a container into a bowl. At the end of your journey, you counted the pebbles and knew exactly how far you had traveled. No electricity, no digital display, just gears, gravity, and pebbles. The Romans used these to measure distances for their famous road network. When engineers built the Roman roads, they needed precision, and they had it. This counting mechanism was later adapted for other uses, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the ones that last millennia. 31. Sunglasses seem like a modern accessory, but people have been protecting their eyes from light for at least 1,000 years. In 12th century China, judges wore flat panes of smoky quartz over their eyes during court proceedings. This wasn't for sun protection. It was to hide their facial expressions from defendants, so nobody could read their reactions during testimony. Long before that, Inuit people in the Arctic carved bone or ivory goggles with narrow slits to prevent snow blindness. The slits reduced glare without needing tinted lenses at all. In 18th century Venice, gondoliers wore tinted glass lenses to protect against light reflecting off the water. Sunglasses as fashion didn't really explode until the 1920s and 1930s with Hollywood and the military. But the basic concept of covering your eyes to reduce light goes back centuries, invented independently by people with very different problems. 32. The steam engine is supposed to be the invention that launched the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, but a version existed in the 1st century AD. Hero of Alexandria, the same inventor who built the vending machine and automatic doors, created the Aeolipile. It was a hollow sphere, mounted on 2 pipes above a boiling cauldron. Steam entered the sphere and escaped through 2 bent nozzles, causing it to spin rapidly. It was a genuine steam-powered rotary engine. So why didn't ancient Rome have trains? Because nobody saw it as anything more than a clever toy or temple attraction. Labor was cheap thanks to slavery, so there was no economic pressure to mechanize. The technology existed. The vision didn't. Humanity had the steam engine 17 centuries before we figured out what to actually do with it. 33. The Antikythera mechanism is possibly the most mind-blowing ancient artifact ever discovered. Pulled from a Roman shipwreck in 1901, this corroded lump of bronze turned out to be an analog computer from around the 1st century BC. It used dozens of interlocking gears to predict astronomical positions, lunar phases, eclipses, and even the timing of the ancient Olympic Games. You turned a crank, and dials on the front displayed where the sun, moon, and planets would be on any given date. Nothing this sophisticated appeared again in the historical record for over 1,000 years. The craftsmanship suggests it wasn't a one-off prototype. There were probably others, now lost. Ancient Greeks had programmable astronomical computers, and then somehow that knowledge vanished. We only learned what it did in the 2000s using X-ray imaging. History is full of things we forgot we ever knew. Sharks older than trees. Fax machines older than telephones. Vikings doing rap battles. And somehow we lost most of this knowledge and had to reinvent it centuries later. Makes you wonder what we know right now that future humans will have to rediscover because we forgot to write it down properly. Alright, here's the real question. Which ancient civilization would absolutely destroy us today if they had access to modern resources? Drop your answer below. And if this video made you feel slightly less superior to your ancestors, subscribe and like.